Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis, Endowment's Donor Engagement and Partnerships Lead. I'm so excited for this day, or week rather. I'm glad it's finally here. For those of you who just joined our previous panel, you heard a lot around crypto policy and regulations. At Endowment, we find ourselves at the intersection of two critical areas that are top of mind for policymakers and legislators, both crypto policy and donor advised fund policy. I'm excited to introduce Ali Bedford, who is an expert in the donor advised fund space. She will share more about the regulations around DAFs, what they mean for the industry, and what we can do to lend our voice. Ali is vice president at Integer, an advocacy firm based in Washington, D.C. that specializes in tax and nonprofit policy. With a robust background in government relations, Ali works closely with clients to advance their policy priorities and protect their interests in the tax code. Her expertise lies in tax-exempt policy and extends to mission-driven initiatives. She's part of the DAF practice at Integer and has spent a lot of time understanding legislative and regulatory landscape for this giving vehicle. Ali, I will pass it over to you. Thank you so much.
Just to confirm, is my audio better? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, great. Perfect. Thanks,
okay.
Ali.
Great. Sorry about that. It's always something
No
with technology.
All good.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to join you guys today to talk about donor advised funds and kind of where we are in the legislative and regulatory landscape. And knowing that there's likely some of the audience that are not familiar with donor advised funds, wanted to kick it off with just a quick background and overview that's going to really shed some light on why policymakers and folks here in Washington, D.C. are really thinking about and talking about donor advised funds more and more. So to kick us started, a donor advised fund is a flexible and cost-effective charitable giving vehicle that allows donors to give money to charity with ease. These are really seen as a easy and effective way to quickly deploy money to your favorite charities and your favorite causes. DAFs themselves are 501c3 charities. They are established at public charities, and they allow individuals to put money in. They can claim a charitable deduction, and then they can advise on where and how their dollars that they put into their DAF are given to charity. Something to note, once money goes into a donor advised fund, it is irrevocable. It cannot come back out and be used for anything it has other than being directed directly to a 501c3 charity. So on the screen, you can kind of see some of our most recent statistics about donor advised funds. So while donor advised funds have been around for almost 100 years now, they've really grown more and more in popularity over the last few decades. In 2002, as you can see, more than $52 billion were granted from donor advised funds to charity. And we're seeing more investment and wealth advisors actually talking with their clients and recommending donor advised funds more for use of their clients now more than ever. Really, that's because DAFs are accessible. They're accessible to all types of donors, not just those that are kind of the ultra wealthy or those that have a lot of money to give to charity. A recent report from the DAF Research Collaborative actually found that half of the DAF accounts they looked into over a 9-year period actually had less than $50,000 in their accounts at the end of 2021. And only about 7% had more than $1 million. So you can kind of see that this is really a mid-range philanthropy vehicle for all types of donors. And, while some DAF sponsors do require a certain minimum contribution amount to open a DAF, many don't. Some of them don't have any minimum initial contribution at all, while others require a really low cost. So it really is an easy to use and effective vehicle for all types of donors, not just those that are in the larger income brackets. I also, want to note that as we think about the next generation of philanthropy and the great wealth transfer, which you might have heard about, but there's, $80 trillion that's going to be changing hands in the next 10 years. And donor advised funds are likely going to continue to be the chosen vehicle, especially for those next gen donors. So I certainly think that we're going to continue to see DAFs be a popular charitable giving tool and vehicle for all types of donors. So unfortunately, like with all things, with growth and increased popularity, you get more eyes and more criticisms and more questions. And that is certainly true for the donor advised fund. In the policy world, over the last several decades, as the growth of donor advised funds has occurred, it has put more eyes on the giving vehicle by policymakers and by those that are in kind of the tax exempt sector and space. So unfortunately, with that and with that growth, it has pointed to some here in Washington to really view whether or not there needs to be additional restrictions on the giving vehicle and whether or not, there's money in DAFs that could be used to pay for other policy priorities. So quickly thinking through kind of the donor advised fund from the regulatory and legislative perspective. Like I mentioned, DAFs themselves are accounts at 501c3 public charities. And prior to 2006, the donor advised fund wasn't referenced in the tax code. While they've been in use for over 100 years, no one here in Congress had done any legislating or regulating on the giving vehicle. So in 2006, Congress put forward legislation called the Pension Protection Act that put, for the first time ever, measures in place that referenced and regulated donor advised funds. So why does that matter for where we are today? So in the regulatory space, Treasury has just now turned their attention to working on regulations that deal with donor advised funds. And this is all stemming from that 2006 legislation. So we're 17 years down the road now, looking at legislation, and Treasury's looking at that legislation and what regulations need to be put in place. Oh, apologies. Moving too quickly here. There we go. So sticking with the regulations for a moment, these Treasury, as some might know, has the authority to regulate and based on legislation that Congress puts forward. So we're 17 years down the line, unfortunately. So Treasury is regulating based on comments that they received 17 years ago in relation to this 2006 legislation. So Treasury, at the end of last year, in November, put forward regulations that dealt with donor advised funds. And these were largely definitional in nature. And we're creating definitions for things like a donor advised fund and for a personal investment advisor and for distributions. But the kind of issue here is the broad brush that Treasury took when crafting these definitions. And they really stand, if these proposed regulations are finalized in their current form, really stand to make sweeping changes to the way DAFs are used and the way DAFs are potentially advised from, or at least recommended by, investment advisors. So on the screen, you can see a couple of the big buckets of where Treasury is looking. I would say that the largest concerns and pushback have really been around the classifying a personal investment advisor as an advisor, which would therefore institute a tax if an advisor advises on not only a person's personal wealth, but also their donor advised fund. So that could disrupt the pipeline of personal investment advisors actually recommending the use of DAFs to their clients, which in turn could really disrupt the pipeline of the amount of donors and dollars that are going into donor advised funds and therefore going back out to charity. So every piece of feedback from DAF sponsors signals that these regs would reduce charitable giving and would disrupt this pipeline for donors to DAFs. And right now, Treasury, I think, is weeding through all of the comments that they received and the feedback that they received from stakeholders in regard to these proposed regulations. Treasury received more than 100 substantive comments and heard from quite a few of folks who actually took the time to come to Washington to testify in front of Treasury to share their concerns about these proposed regulations. So while the timing is slightly unclear for when Treasury is going to put forward final regulations for these definitions, they could do so at any time, but we are not thinking that we will see those until at least early next year at the earliest, but they could release them at any time between now and the end of the year or further down the line next year as well. But why this really matters is because what we know Treasury is going to look to next is additional regulations on the use of donor advised funds based on a 2017 notice. So these are all kind of laying the groundwork for what we view as further regulatory action from the Treasury Department. So switching gears, because unfortunately it's not all just regulators that are looking into donor advised funds, but it is lawmakers as well. So thinking about Congress and what lawmakers here in DC are thinking about, we've seen legislative proposals introduced in previous Congresses that really aim to reform DAFs, their use, and things such as their payouts. As you might know, donor advised funds do not have any payout requirements like that of private foundations, and lawmakers have looked at whether or not they should. This legislation and these legislative proposals that have been introduced in the past were met with quite a bit of pushback from folks in the sector. They didn't materialize into much, didn't gain a lot of steam, and kind of hit Congress with a thud. However, I do think that we anticipate seeing additional legislative reform efforts of some nature around donor advised funds in future Congresses. So kind of sticking with this theme, folks might be aware that 2025 is going to be a big year in the tax policy space. This is what us tax wonks here in DC like to call the tax Super Bowl. And 2025 is really going to be a big year in which donor advised funds could find themselves in the mix and potentially could be seen as a way to help pay for 2025 tax reform. So 2025, large portions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are set to expire, the individual provisions from that bill. So lawmakers here in DC and tax writers have already begun work to determine how they want to address these expiring provisions and what else they might want to include in a larger tax reform package. And with that, means they are looking for shiny dollar signs. They are looking for ways to pay for these tax changes. And we've already heard that they're looking at large endowments and they're looking at other places from the charitable sector and other ways that they can tap into funding streams in order to pay for individual tax provisions. And with that, donor advised funds could be on the table. I don't think it's outside of the realm to assume that donor advised funds might be looked at next year as a way to help pay for tax reform. So, all of this is to say that I think while a donor advised fund is a very flexible, lovely, one of my preferred charitable giving tools, I do think that as lawmakers continue to take a closer look at the tax exempt sector, they have been scrutinizing the sector more of late. And while that hasn't translated to them looking specifically at donor advised funds, they very well could be on the table as a shiny pot of money for lawmakers as they look for ways to pay for their tax plans. So we have flown through this very quickly. So I'm happy to answer questions on more of kind of the details if we want to go backward, but just thinking about, leaving things on a more positive note, there are always ways that you can get involved, whether you are a donor, whether you're an investment advisor, a DAF sponsor, someone who just has a stake in this and wants to get more involved because you just love the donor advised fund as much as I do, you can join the conversation. We recommend that you talk to the associations you're already a part of. join DC coalitions that are already doing this work. There are certainly a few that are already knee-deep in the regulatory and legislative space on this. And then just generally make sure your lawmakers and their staff really understand how these regulations or potential legislation can impact the work that you're doing, and really impact the work that's being done in their communities. I think the thing that I always like to share with folks is lawmakers want to hear from you. They work for you. They're up here in Washington working for their districts and their community, and they don't know what's going on in their backyards unless they hear from you about it. So make sure that you're alerting them, alerting their staff, and letting them know how different pieces of legislation or regulatory pieces from different agencies might impact the work that you're doing for their community.
Thank you, Ali. I have a question, and then I had a few like private message questions, but for anybody who is listening, please post your questions in the chat or feel free to privately message myself or anyone on the endowment team, and we can go ahead and share those. I do have a personal kind of question and little endowment shameless plug, but you talked about the payout rate, and I work at endowment in the DAF space, came from the DAF space. I know this is very much a hot topic issue in the DAF and nonprofit world. Obviously affecting the DAF sponsor like endowment, but also affecting nonprofits who are receiving grants from donor advised funds. So I'm curious, at endowment, we have a 2-year inactive fund policy, and our framework and our fee model is actually aligned toward grant making. So the fee that we take is based on people granting out, not keeping money in funds. We're incentivizing our donors to mobilize resources to nonprofits, some of whom are on this call right now. And how do we ensure that legislators know that not all DAF sponsors are created equal? I think oftentimes we talk about this payout rate, we talk about the kind of big players in the DAF space taking a quarterly fee based on assets under management. And how do we talk about the other DAF platforms like endowment who have a completely different model, but that legislators may not be aware of?
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, not all DAF sponsor is created equal. There are DAF sponsors that are more mission-based and have different parameters that their donors are looking for. And, they all have their different rules because there are no required payout rates or required measures in that way. But I will say that a lot of DAF sponsors do have something in place, whether it's an inactive fund policy or some kind of measure of that way. But I think the biggest thing to answer your question is really sharing how you are different, sharing how the principles and the practices that you have in place that are really working for your donor advised funds and for your donors, and letting lawmakers know, how that's working, any information or data. Lawmakers love data. Their staff love data. They're looking for data. And I think this just goes back to, if you're not advocating for what you're doing and you're not educating on how your organization or your DAF sponsor is different, or your donor advised fund is different, or perhaps some of your rules or principles that you might have in place or best practices, they're not going to know or understand them. And I think that right now what we are seeing in Congress, not just with donor advised funds, but with kind of the entire tax exempt charitable sector, is that there's a lack of understanding. And I think a lot of it is from a lack of education. So we're trying to do our part here in DC to educate lawmakers and staff, but I do think it's so important, whether it's just a quick email, a letter that you send, a note, meeting with them in district, but really sharing those best practices, I'll use endowment, that you guys have at endowment, and how that's working for you, and sharing how that might differ from other DAF sponsors, and how they might be doing and running their DAFs.
Awesome, thank you. Another question we got, which is very connected, but how do we connect with lawmakers on this, right? Whether you're a donor who has a DAF and you're trying to say, hey, I'm using my DAF for good, I'm not just parking assets, or whether you're a nonprofit trying to advocate very tangibly, like how does one connect with lawmakers. I think this is a theme that also kind of transpired on the earlier crypto policy panel. And I think it's something that a lot of folks are thinking about. A lot of people say connect with legislators, but how do you actually go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it is as easy as you can, like I said, send a letter, send an email, send a note. They all have, there are different platforms, but if you Google who's my House of Representatives, you can put your zip code in and it'll tell you who your specific district or legislator is and how to contact them. I will say, in terms of joining some of these policy conversations, if you're part of an association or you're part of a coalition who's working here in DC, I would start with talking with them. A lot of associations and a lot of DC coalitions are, like I mentioned, already doing this work, and they might have a good way for you to join meetings with maybe a few other folks so that it's not just you in the room if you're new to educating your lawmakers and their staff. And that can really kind of help you like see who out of maybe your district or who out of your footprint makes the most sense to meet with, and maybe some background there. So that would be where I'd start. If you have associations or coalitions you're members of, I'd start there. But otherwise, it really isn't, anyone can come up to Congress, anyone can walk into the House or the Senate, anyone can email their lawmakers and their staff. And I really do think it's just that simple. There's also other ways to get information in front of your lawmakers. You can write an opinion piece and get it published in your local newspaper. You can attend teletown halls. Lawmakers are all back in their home districts right now, so attend one of the meetings that they're having. And those are often listed on their website or can be found as well. But there's a number of ways to do it. So I certainly recommend that you, even if it's just a quick email, at least trying to engage with your lawmakers and their staff.
That's awesome. Thank you. And, this is a lot of why we're here today, meeting and connecting with folks like yourself, like people at policy organizations like Integer and others who know a lot about what's going on in the donor advised fund space and who we can turn to share use cases, ask questions. I know personally, I have reached out to the Integer team multiple times to ask questions and have been just kind of staying educated and on top of what's going on. So just appreciate you lending your expertise, and for organizations out there like Integer and others that can just be that resource and that go-to, because this world of policy is very overwhelming and large, and to have someone break it down for you is extremely helpful. So I appreciate that. We have one last question. And again, if anyone else on the call has questions, please pose them in the chat or DM us. But one more question is, why do you think regulators are turning to DAFs now? Is there any historical legislation that has kind of taken a deep dive into DAFs, and why now, do you think?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, regulators are looking at regulations that stem from legislation from 17 years ago. So I unfortunately don't have a crystal ball or any way to look that far back as to why they waited this long to actually turn to these regulations. There are thoughts, and my own personal thoughts could be the growth and the popularity of the giving vehicle has put more of an emphasis and more attention, rightfully so, on the donor advised fund because of really the large amount of growth that has happened, especially in the last 10 to 20 years. The number of DAFs that have been opened and the number of donors that are using them to deploy their charitable dollars. So there's a chance Treasury just decided this was the time and they should probably look into this now. But, kind of unclear why now. I do think there's many in the sector who shared concerns about the regulations because Treasury was operating off of comments that they received 17 years ago, which really isn't indicative of the donor advised field that we see today. And so I think that's where a lot of the comments came from in terms of sharing concerns, because what was 17 years ago for the donor advised fund is certainly not the same as what it is today. But unfortunately, not sure why now, but I do think that we are gearing up to see additional regulatory action from the Treasury Department in the years to come.
Amazing. And sometimes when people look into something like a DAF, it's an opportunity to bring light to what we're doing and potentially can be used for positive. So we will see. Fingers crossed, everyone. Ali, I want to thank you so much for lending your expertise about the DAF space and the regulatory framework. As you can see on the screen, scan the QR code, reach out to Ali, reach out to Integer, keep abreast with what's going on in the DAF space. I'm sure Ali and the team would love to hear from you. We are going to do a quick video break in here. And then we have a fireside chat after that, starting at about 3:45 Eastern time with Vance Spencer from Framework Ventures and Amanda from Serotonin. That'll take place at 3:45. And then later on, okay, we got one more question. Any research on the increase of generosity in DAFs and the US Giving Report? Possible more generosity than fully reported? I guess we're going back to you, Ali, and then we'll wrap up and do our video break.
And I think we're talking about the Giving USA report that just came out that looks backward at last year's giving. I have not seen the full report yet, unfortunately, and they did not talk about DAFs when they put forward the key top lines of the report. I know in future years, Giving USA has created a section that talked about giving from donor advised funds. So I unfortunately will have to follow up with you once I take a look at the full report to see if they did include a section in donor advised funds and the generosity that's coming from them. But I will note that there are other, we're seeing more and more reports and more folks looking into donor advised funds. I know there was a recent report, I believe from Chariot, that actually looked at donor behavior from giving from a fund, a donor advised fund versus giving in other ways. And I think they found that it was 3 times more likely, don't quote me on that, but certainly more likely to give more if using a DAF than if not. So I do think we're going to start seeing more folks look into donor behavior using donor advised funds and certainly the generosity that's coming from them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I also just popped in the chat. The DAF Research Collaborative is also a great resource. I know you mentioned them earlier, Ali. We've seen them speak at various conferences, and they have super comprehensive data on who DAF users are, age demographics, how much they're giving annually. Super, super interesting. Also had read the Chariot report. So there's a lot of great resources out there. Again, whether you're a donor, a policymaker, a nonprofit, good to just keep up to date with what's going on. Amazing. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat or in our DM, so I will go ahead and reconclude. But thank you again so much for sharing your insights today. I want to give everyone, I know we've been a little bit back to back in our sessions, and everyone could probably use a break, get some coffee, stretch. So we will be showing a little video break here. And then, as I mentioned before, a fireside chat at 3:45. So in a little over 10 minutes with Framework Ventures and Serotonin. It should be amazing and just a great, Vance is awesome. And Amanda is as well. And then we will conclude with a networking power hour. So, you know, a lot of the speakers you've heard today have digital expo halls. You can connect with them individually, ask any questions that you weren't able to on the various panels throughout the day, and should be a great opportunity to connect with not only the speakers, but also other attendees of OGS. So we will see our video break and hope to see you at 3:45 shortly.